Mass deportation and the relocation of U.S. citizen prisoners, a constitutional and human rights violation. Introduction. The United States has long prided itself on upholding the rule of law and constitutional protections for all individuals within its jurisdiction. However, mass deportations and the relocation of U.S. citizen prisoners to other countries for imprisonment raise serious constitutional and human rights concerns. These actions violate fundamental due process rights, undermine the principles of equal protection, and contravene international human rights standards. This article explores the constitutional and human rights violations inherent in these practices. Mass deportation and due process violations. Mass deportation policies, particularly those that expedite removal without adequate legal proceedings, violate the 5th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. These amendments ensure that no person, regardless of citizenship status, can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. 1. Fifth Amendment. Due Process Clause. Mass deportations often involve expedited removal processes, denying non-citizens the opportunity to present their case before an immigration judge. Immigrants who have lived in the U.S. for years, established families, and contributed to their communities may be forcibly removed without fair legal proceedings. 2. 14th Amendment. Equal Protection Clause. Disproportionate targeting of specific racial or ethnic groups in deportation efforts raises concerns about discriminatory enforcement. Deportation policies that fail to consider individual circumstances, such as asylum claims, family ties, or the risk of persecution in home countries, violate principles of fairness and equal protection. Historical precedent. Mass deportation and rights violations. The U.S. has engaged in mass deportations in the past, often with devastating consequences. One example is the Mexican repatriation, 1929 to 1936, during which an estimated 1.8 million people of Mexican descent, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed to Mexico. 1. Constitutional violations. Due process denial. Many individuals were deported without hearings or legal representation. Discriminatory targeting. People of Mexican descent were targeted based on ethnicity rather than immigration status. This mass deportation policy was later acknowledged as a violation of civil rights, underscoring the dangers of disregarding due process protections in immigration enforcement. International human rights implications. Mass deportations violate several international human rights standards, including 1. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, Article 9, protection from arbitrary arrest, detention, and exile. 2. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, Article 13, prohibits arbitrary expulsion and requires due process in deportation cases. 3. UN Convention Against Torture, prohibits returning individuals to countries where they may face torture or inhumane treatment. Relocating U.S. citizen prisoners to other countries. A grave constitutional violation. The practice of relocating U.S. citizen prisoners to foreign countries for imprisonment is another severe constitutional and human rights violation. The U.S. government has the responsibility to uphold constitutional protections for its citizens, even when incarcerated. 1. Fifth Amendment violations. Transferring U.S. citizen prisoners to foreign prisons without their consent denies them due process rights and access to U.S. legal protections. 2. Eighth Amendment violations. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Imprisoning U.S. citizens in countries where they face inhumane conditions, torture, or lack of legal representation constitutes a violation of this protection. 3. 14th Amendment violations. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. Forcibly relocating prisoners based on nationality or other discriminatory factors violates this fundamental principle. Case study: Guantanamo Bay and the treatment of detainees. A key example of constitutional and human rights violations in the relocation of prisoners is the use of Guantanamo Bay to detain individuals without proper legal proceedings. 1. Lack of due process. Detainees have been held indefinitely without trial, violating constitutional rights to a fair trial. 2. Harsh conditions. Reports of torture, inhumane treatment, and denial of legal representation highlight severe human rights abuses. 3. Precedent for future violations. The continued use of offshore detention facilities raises concerns about the potential for U.S. citizens to be subjected to similar treatment. Conclusion. The U.S. Constitution explicitly guarantees due process, equal protection, and protection against cruel and unusual punishment for all individuals under U.S. jurisdiction, including non-citizens and prisoners. Mass deportations that bypass legal proceedings violate these constitutional principles and international human rights standards. Similarly, the forced relocation of U.S. citizen prisoners to foreign countries denies them fundamental rights and exposes them to potential human rights abuses. Upholding constitutional and human rights protections is not merely a legal obligation, but a moral imperative to ensure justice, fairness, and dignity for all individuals.